does AI know history? If you hadn't noticed, AI chatbots have been getting pretty big recently. Honestly, when these chatbots first emerged, I didn't think people would use them very often. Clearly, I was wrong. People are using these AI chatbots for a variety of purposes on a regular basis. So why should it matter if AI knows history? Well, questions that once would have been answered through a Google search are now being handled by AI. In fact, Google has directly baked AI features into its search engine. Additionally, students, both in high school and college, are using AI to either entirely write essays for them or even to help with the research and writing process. Clearly, many people are relying on AI for accurate historical information. So today, we're going to find out how well AI knows history. I'm going to ask a series of historical questions to ChatGPT that will grow increasingly difficult. I'll break these questions down into two different categories. The first is what I'm calling daily history questions, meaning the type of question you might have in your day-to-day life where you're wondering, when did something happen, why did it happen, that sort of thing. The second are what I'm calling academic questions. Now, these are the type of questions that students will be asking AI to write an essay for them, maybe to generate a list of sources, to summarize a particular historical debate. And within both of these categories, there will be both easier and more challenging questions to see what can the AI handle and what can it not. I will be asking questions on topics that I'm familiar with, so I can do the fact-checking, so this test may not be more widely applicable. Additionally, as you might have noticed, these AI chatbots can give different answers to the exact same question, so this may not be broadly generalizable, but it will be interesting. So regardless, let's do some testing. Okay, so now we've got ChatGPT pulled up. We're going to get started with some basic daily historical questions. We're talking about your who, what, where questions. We'll get to the why questions in a moment. Those are a little more complex. These are simple, pretty objective type questions. So our first one is, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? Pretty easy. Adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, not officially signed by most until August 2nd. Some members may have signed later. You may have signed in or around July 4th. Okay, yeah, so that is correct information. Like I said, this is a fairly simple objective question. I will point out, even with this though, one of the differences between asking ChatGPT and looking it up on Google is that if you're looking something up on Google, you'll open up a web page, you know where your information is from. And of course, any responsible article should be citing their sources. This is a very useful thing. Whereas you're asking ChatGPT right here, you don't know where this information is coming from. Though we could suppose I could try asking, where are you getting this information? So it gives you a couple of different sources. Pretty broad though, not incredibly specific. Let's say, yes, give me direct links. And see what it offers to us. Because this will maybe show us where it's getting all of its information from. Okay. So what it actually comes down to is a page from the National Archives, National Park Service, and Wikipedia. Yeah, so skimming through this article from the National Archives is essentially that information we just got from ChatGPT. And I would take this as reliable information, but you do gotta do a little digging to find out where this is coming from. Same thing with this article from the National Park Service. And I imagine the Wikipedia page says something similar, and it's probably drawing from many of the same sources. So, if you're asking a basic question like that, maybe not so much of a problem, though I would prefer that in giving the initial answer, ChatGPT would provide those sources. Anyway, let's ask a couple more of these basic historical questions. So our next one is, when was the United Kingdom created? Now this one's a little more complex. There's perhaps a couple different dates that could be given. We'll see what ChatGPT has to say about it. Interesting. So, created in 1707 through the Acts of Union, which is probably the answer I would have given as well. But it does give us a further timeline. for some additional information, which notes very importantly that Ireland, and you only get the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801, right? So that's some important information to add. We could go through and ask for the sources again. I imagine it would be similar to what we did last time. We're getting some pretty popular and relatively reliable type sources. I'd say with ChatGPT, if all it's doing is skimming a web page and giving you the same information, well, that's pretty easy. You're bound to get a reliable answer if it's drawing from a reliable source. But of course, the issue is you do need to dig a little deeper to get which sources it's using. So that's another answer that's pretty accurate. All right, so our last question of this beginning group is who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the foundational document of the French Revolution. Now, there's a couple different names I'm expecting to see here. We'll see if it gets them all. Primarily written by Lafayette with the assistance of Jefferson. Okay. Okay, so they're missing some detail here. So your first draft of the Declaration was primarily drafted by Lafayette with the assistance of Jefferson. However, what you're missing here is the final draft had significant, some could say overwhelming influence from the Abbé Sieyès and Mirabeau. Right? So two of these other pretty prominent French revolutionary figures. Maybe I can tease that out with another question. We'll ask, did anyone else work on the final draft of the document? Okay. Yeah, so the two names I mentioned, one additional. Alright, so this is one where I would say there actually was some missing detail in the initial answer. You can sort of tease it out with additional questioning. Though, once again, you're going to have to ask if you want to see the sources ChatGPT is using. I guess is kind of the point of all this, is that it scrapes a lot of sources and then you can't necessarily separate them. But when you're doing history, sourcing is extremely important. So with that, we're going to stick with our daily questions, but we're going to ask some more complex daily questions. The why questions. Why did this happen? Why did this person do this? So we're still covering the type of questions that you might look up in your daily life. If you read something or someone told you something, you wanted to Google search something, but they'll be a little more complicated. And importantly, they'll be a little more subjective, right? So this is one thing I'm interested in, is that these sort of basic objective questions where you can draw from a singular web page, I think ChatGPT can generally do something like that. I'm wondering how it takes on more subjective questions. Now, I'll point out, just because a question is more subjective doesn't mean you can't answer it incorrectly, right? Our subjective answers to these historical questions still need to be backed up by true information and reliable sources, which is why I'm interested on what ChatGPT will say to these questions. So our next question is a what question, but it is a little more obscure than some of these other topics. Remember, we're asking questions about stuff that I know, so early American Republic, Haitian Revolution, things like that. Those are sort of my fields of expertise. So we've got the question, what did Henri Christophe do as King of Haiti? It's a pretty easy question, but it's a little less well known than some of these other questions we've seen. All right, so we have another numbered list. I'm realizing today that ChatGPT really loves a numbered list, and we'll see what it says. So Christophe was a prominent leader in the Haitian Revolution, later became the King of Haiti. That's very true. Played a central role in the development of the new nation. Significant achievements, challenges, okay, broad. Let's see what they say in particular. So they start off with his role in the Haitian Revolution, which is fine, but it's not really what I asked about. Becoming King of Haiti. So after Dessalines is assassinated, the country's divided, the north under Christophe, the south under Alexandre Pétion. He declares himself king. Sure, okay, this is all very fair. Sort of waiting still for what he actually does during his reign. So they talk about his constitution here, his administrative reforms, creating a central bureaucracy, economic development. Yeah, okay, so this stuff is true. Infrastructure, Palace of Sanssouci. Yeah, this is actually something he accomplishes. Some more infrastructure projects. Talk about his authoritarian rule. Ruled as an absolute monarch. maintained a powerful and loyal military force, repression of political opponents. These are certainly all things that he did. I would argue this is more a summary of sort of the reign generally, or the life of Henri Christophe. I guess I was more looking for sort of a list of accomplishments, not necessarily in a positive sense, just what did he do, what did he achieve. I will say there's a lot of detail missing here. There's a lot more to be said about agriculture. You know, you get a brief line here, but you could talk about Henri Christophe's labor regime. You could talk about the building of many schools throughout the country, bringing in foreign advisors, all his correspondence with foreign advisors and foreign abolitionists, sort of foreign policy. So I'd say this is one where there is a fair amount missed, I think because maybe it is more of an obscure historical topic, though Henri Christophe is better known now than he was a few years ago. So this is something I was wondering about, which is, I think the more popular historical topics, it's far more easy to find and scrape sources from the internet. The answers will tend to be more accurate. But I wonder with the more obscure historical questions, if it will begin missing detail or getting things wrong. So I'd say here, it's more there's a fair amount missed in this answer. So our next question, another Haiti one, will be who was the Baron du Vastey and what did he accomplish throughout his life? So another more obscure character, though pretty prominent in the history of early Haiti. I think all these guys are fascinating, but I guess compared to the Roman Empire, it's a little more obscure. So we'll see what they say. So we've got an issue right at the beginning of the description here, which is they say Baron du Vastey, born Pierre-François Léonard Dufresne. That's not his name. Now, there is some historical questions about his name. Often the name Pompey Valentin Vastey is associated with him. Now, I'll direct you to a book on this. So the 2014, I believe, English translation of Vastey's Colonial Systems Unveiled, translated and edited by Chris Bongie, talks a bit about his real name, and he sort of uncovers through his research that it was Jean-Louis, the name Pompey or Pompey. It wasn't actually given to him. But this name here, this has never been associated with Vastey. Pierre-François. I've looked this name up. I don't know who this is supposed to be. I don't know if this is someone, a real person, or where they got this name from. But whatever Vastey's name was, which I believe was Jean-Louis, as Bongie talks about in his book, it definitely was not that. So that's just blatantly untrue right there at the beginning. Also, these years of his life are entirely false. So it says 1796 through 1842. That's not accurate at all. If this is true, he would have been born pretty deep into the Haitian Revolution, which isn't accurate. So he was born in 1781 until 1820. Once again, I'll reference that same book. That's sort of pretty generally agreed upon right there. So these dates, not true in the slightest. So a big stumble here in the outset. The name and the date of birth and death, it's all wrong. Let's see the description here. He was a prominent Haitian intellectual, writer, and political figure. That's true. Who played a significant role in the early post-revolutionary history of Haiti. He's best known for his contributions to Haitian thought and his advocacy for the unique identity and cultural heritage of the Haitian people after their successful revolution against French colonial rule. Yeah, so I'd say that's largely an accurate description. I mean, there's more you can add in there. You can maybe frame it differently. In fact, you definitely could. But that's a fine explanation of who he was, but the information here, we're starting off not great. We've got another issue here that talks about one of Vastey's most significant intellectual contributions. It's this essay titled The African Civilization, which is written in 1814 and published in 1817. This doesn't exist. This is a fake essay. Now, there's a couple of different pieces of literature, essays they might be referencing. He's got reflections on the blacks and whites, remarks upon a letter, etc., 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 where within the title you have The Civilization of Africa. This is published in 1816. So the dates aren't right, the title's not right. I mean, I don't know what they're talking about here. This is not a real piece of literature authored by Vastey. From the description here, it seems like he's talking about reflections on the blacks and whites, but they've just totally botched the dates and the title. So yeah, another one that if you were relying on this for accurate historical information, you'd be very confused. You would have no idea what you were looking for and why this supposed essay didn't actually exist. Another just really silly mistake here, where it talks about Henri Christophe dying in 1820, Haiti being united under Boyer, and how Vastey, who was a big supporter of Christophe, saw his influence fall, but he remained committed to advocating for the unique identity of Haiti. He continues to write all this sort of stuff. Vastey died in 1820. He was killed. As part of that overthrow of Henri Christophe, he was executed. So this is entirely false. He passes away. Baron de Vastey passed away in 1842. No, he didn't. He was killed in 1820. This is entirely incorrect. In fact, let me see if I can interrogate the AI here on its misconceptions. So here I've written, you claim that Vastey died in 1842, but it's well documented he was killed in 1820. Why have you included false information, and where did you get this information from? Okay, so it's apologizing, saying you're correct, he died in 1820, etc., etc. As for where the mistake came from, it was an error. I draw on a combination of historical texts, research, and general knowledge. But sometimes errors can creep in, particularly with complex historical figures whose lives are sometimes surrounded by ambiguities or conflicting records. Yeah, so this is not really a satisfactory response, right? Now, once again, it's not that, of course, you can find incorrect information everywhere on the internet, but you can at least see who's writing it, right? And if you don't know, or if there's incorrect information, you can sort of point it out. Whereas here, it can't even tell me where this incorrect information came from. Why is there this mistake here, right? Why are there multiple mistakes? I have no idea where it got this 1842 date from. No clue, right? But it's incorrect, which of course is an issue. He dies in 1820 after the collapse of Christophe's northern kingdom. He'd been an important figure, but was politically sidelined. He wasn't sidelined, he was literally killed. Let's see if I can ask about why they got the name wrong as well. So once again, I've said you claim this was his name, but it's untrue. I'm asking again, where did you get this false information from? But I'm not sure we'll get any more a specific response than we did last time. You made an error. His real name was Jean-Louis Donatien du Vastey. So that's not right either. It's closer to right, but it's still not quite right. There is no documented evidence or credible historical source that connects Vastey with that name. Okay, so why did you tell me that? Inaccurate or poorly sourced information. Okay, so you still haven't got his name right. It's less inaccurate, but still inaccurate. And once again, it can't tell me why has it said this fake name, right? If I'm reading an article, I see something is wrong, can usually be like, okay, why is this wrong? Did you make it up? Did you find an incorrect source? What is that source? Here, I don't know why it's given me incorrect information, but it has. So that was the last of our daily questions. I know it got pretty complex by the end, but I was still trying to judge things you may be interested in, sort of just in your life. Next, we're going to move on to academic questions. So, once again, questions that students, either in high school, or I'm mainly thinking of college, would have for a chatbot like this. Questions about finding particular sources to help them write an essay, to help with research, summarizing particular historical moments or debates, or even, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to write me an essay on a couple of different topics. I'm going to go through and look at that essay. We'll grade it, and we'll see how well it does. So these are these academic questions that would be more relevant to students. Okay, so my first question, or really my first request, is provide me with a list of secondary and primary sources for an essay I am writing about Thomas Jefferson's thoughts and policy regarding public education. So I wrote an essay on this during my undergrad. Now, not to sound too old, but we didn't have these types of AI chatbots back when I was at school, so I couldn't have used one of these, but it's something I know a little bit about. Now, to be clear and to be transparent, I would never want anyone to use an AI like this to write an essay for them. One, because I don't think it'd be very good. Two, you're sort of missing the point. Three, you'll get yourself in trouble. But asking it to find some sources, I could imagine that being useful. Now, we've already seen it provide incorrect information, but we'll see if it can do a good job with this question. Okay, so the list of primary sources here, I would say in some ways is an alright beginning, but a relatively incomplete list. So we start off with Jefferson's autobiography. Yeah, I mean, that's relevant to read if you're writing about Jefferson, but there are more relevant texts if you're concerned about education. Notes on the state of Virginia. Now, this is a good pick. Query 14, he talks about his ideas of education, public education. This is very relevant. The letters of Thomas Jefferson. Now, I agree with this. There are many different letters. I have many specific letters to and from Jefferson, to and from other of his contemporaries about education, the state of education, his philosophy, all that sort of stuff. I wish they would have listed more of them specifically. That would have been more useful. A bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. This is an absolutely key primary source. There's also an 1817 education bill that should have been included on this list, but was not. But yeah, this is definitely important. Jefferson's draft of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Once again, sure, another important Jefferson primary source, but it's not the most relevant. There are more relevant sources when you're talking about his takes on education and public education in particular. Also, the date here is wrong again. It was passed in 1786, drafted beforehand, but not in 1777. So another incorrect date. Now let's take a look at our secondary sources. So now let's see which secondary sources ChatGPT recommends. So we start off with Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham. Once again, this is a good source generally on Jefferson, though it's more a book you'd read for your own personal entertainment than anything sort of academic. But yeah, a good source. It's not incredibly relevant to his educational ideas. Now, it is to a certain extent, don't get me wrong, but if I was recommending secondary sources on the topic, I probably would not recommend this. Like I said, this is a biography of Jefferson's entire life. Our second source, The Founding Fathers on Education, a collection of speeches and writings, edited by C. Bradley Thompson, is once again not a real source. Right, so I've looked this up. This doesn't exist. It's not a real collection. C. Bradley Thompson is a real guy. He's an academic, and he has written on early American education and education reform, but this is not a real collection of writings, so a fake source. Not great. This source, Jefferson and Education by James L. Lee, I can't find it. I don't think it's a real article. However, why don't we ask ChatGPT? It's provided it, so why don't we see if it can find us this article? If so, that'd be great. It's from 1955, so maybe I just can't find it. That could very well be the case. So let me say, is a real article? And if so, can you find it for me? Pretty reasonable request. Okay. You're correct to question the existence of an article titled Jefferson and Education by James L. Lee, as I couldn't find any verifiable records of such a publication. So it's not real. It's not real. We'll keep going through the original list. I'm not going to go through all of these, because who knows how many of these are fake. I know Carpenter is written on Jefferson and Education, so is Holochok, so I recognize some of these names, right? So off the top of my head, some of these are, well, either real or are by real guys, but how many of these sources we're getting are fake? Once again, that's going to be an issue if you're relying on this to provide you with secondary sources or primary sources. All right, let's look at the rest of our original list. So as far as I can tell, of the rest of this list, the book by Sheldon is real, the book by Randall is real, and the rest of them are all fake. So, this piece by Clark, fake. This piece, fake. Education in Colonial America. There's an article by that name from the 60s, but different date, different author. We talked about C. Bradley Thompson, a real academic. This is not a real work of his. And then this book at the end appears to be fake as well. So, now look, I guess some of these might be incredibly obscure work that aren't popping up anywhere for me. That's possible. It could also be that maybe they're taking book chapters, right? Thompson has written on education, so maybe some of these are chapters from some of his books. I don't know. But these sources, the vast majority of them, at least how they're describes this work as a collection which includes various essays and letters. This is not real. Most of this stuff isn't real. So this has been a big red flag. I honestly did not think it would be so bad. I thought maybe there'd be some sources that weren't so relevant, which is the case, by the way. Even the real secondary sources it's given us are mostly not relevant to the topic at hand. They're mostly broad biographies of Thomas Jefferson. Fine, not really relevant to the topic. There's a lot of different secondary sources, articles, and books I could give you on this topic in particular that are a lot more relevant, right? A lot less general. But yeah, these sources, the ones that are real, are not relevant to the topic really that much, and most of them are fake, which is an issue. That's the big issue here. I'll leave a list of sources down below if you're interested in the topic. That'll all be cited correctly. Sources on Thomas Jefferson and public education. I think I mentioned that I know Holochok, or however you pronounce it, apologies, did write a piece on Jefferson and education. I don't remember if that's what it was called, because there's been a lot of incorrect information here. And Carpenter also wrote an essay on this. That seems, I think that was the title, but that might not be true. Anyway, we'll do a quick Google search. Yeah, okay, so that one's real. They've got the correct title and everything. We'll see if Holochok's is titled correctly. Yep, so that appears to be the right title of his piece as well. So upon prodding, we got at least some accurate sources, and I might as well check some of these as well, see if all of these are real or some of them are fake as well. Okay, so this one by Wagoner, upon first glance, appears to be real. Okay, this one by Neem appears to be real as well. And we'll check out this last one by Gilreath. Okay, so this one appears to be real as well. Now, let me clarify, that does not mean all the information in these descriptions are real, but these ones at least are actual sources. So, I don't really know what's happening here, where it appears upon first questioning, it'll give you a bunch of fake sources, and then if you ask again, it'll be like, oh, well, I've got some real ones. Okay, why not give me the real ones the first time, right? So this is obviously a really big issue if students are using this, and we know they are, to either find sources for them, do research for them, or write essays for them, and we know that college and high school students are doing this, then we know that these AI chatbots will be just making up blatantly false information and false sources. That's how you get a 0 on an assignment, is you turn in something that isn't real. Or something that's plagiarized, right? That's something I haven't covered too much here, but as we know from, reporting on this, a lot of the information, especially if you're asking for a summary or an essay, is going to be essentially plagiarized from different sources. So yeah, but I really think that the making up of information and sources is the most blatant issue here that we've encountered today. Alright, so our next request. I'm writing an essay on Prince Saunders, the African-American education advocate. Provide me a list of primary and secondary sources on this topic. Now this is more similar to that Jefferson question, right? This is a specific historical topic. In fact, I'd say this is even more obscure than Jefferson's opinions on education. A lot more obscure, actually. This is something that, working on this during my master's degree, I had to work pretty hard to find applicable sources on this topic. So I guess we'll see what it gives us here. Frankly, I'd prefer something like a ChatGPT to just say, I don't know, I don't have sources, than to make stuff up. But we'll see what it gives us from this request. Okay, I'll say we've got a better start. The name is right, though I gave it that. And the dates are correct, though there is actually ambiguity in the sources here. We have an obituary about Saunders in 1839, but these dates, to the best of our knowledge, are as close to accurate as we can get. So, better start than we had earlier with Vastey, which kind of surprises me because I would argue Vastey is a far more prominent figure than Saunders. Now, our first primary source here is Saunders' Haitian Papers. Yep, very important source from him. Some of his own commentary on Haiti, also translations of legislation from Haiti, so very important. His address before the Pennsylvania Augustine Society. Yep, a good one, though the date is wrong. Should be 1818. But, I guess that's not that major compared to everything else. So yeah, another important source from him. Now, this last source here, The People of Haiti and Plan of Emigration. Now, I've never heard of this. There are other primary sources attributed to Saunders. I've never heard of this one. I'll do the trick I did earlier, where I'll ask if this is a real source that they've recommended me. Okay, so it's telling me here it's a real work. It's not. I've never seen this before in my life. It says it's not readily available online. You can access it through various academic libraries and archives. And then it says, for instance, Hathi Trust Digital Library provides access to related works. Yeah, but I'm not interested about related works. I want to find this particular source. So this is extra bad, right? Not only has it given me a fake source, a fake primary source no less, but it's insisting that it's real. This is not a real source, right? Like I said, there are other primary sources attributed to Prince Saunders, or Sanders, by the way, we don't know how it's pronounced, that they haven't listed here, but this one is not one of them. It's not real. I'll push a little further, see if it will admit that it's a fake source or not. Alright, I've said it's not a real source. If it is, find me any proof of its existence. I'm not necessarily asking for the source itself, but any reference to it in any library or archive around the world. I've never heard of this source. Apologies. Upon further research, I found that the title, The People of Haiti and Plan of Emigration, attributed to Saunders, does not appear in reputable academic or historic records. Seems there was an error in my previous response. Yeah, I'd say a pretty major error. So we see it can provide you with fake sources when you're asking for a source list, and then, even when you pull the trick sort of, hey, is this a real source? Sometimes it can tell you, yeah, it is, when it's entirely false, right? So that's a big issue. We're not even talking about providing reputable sources. I haven't even really gone into that much. Is this source reputable? Is it a good source? Whatever. We've talked about that a little bit. Is it related to the topic? But a lot of our time has been taken up with entirely false, made-up sources. That's a big issue, right? A really big issue, actually. Okay, so it really stumbled on the primary sources. Now we'll go through our secondary sources. So what we've got here are, the first three are web pages. 3 is Wikipedia, which I'd say is not a great secondary source to recommend. In fact, you'd be better off just searching up Prince Saunders and going onto Wikipedia and using their secondary sources they've referenced anyway. These first 2 are sort of general web pages. We're not talking about particular journal articles or anything. The one real good recommendation here is Alsonat's, it says podcast, and I guess there is a video, there's a podcast on it, but really what this is a PhD dissertation on Saunders. This is a source that I used when I was writing my MA paper on Saunders, right? So this is definitely a good one, though, once again, sort of misidentified here. There's a podcast about it, but you'd probably want to recommend the PhD dissertation. That's what you'd be referencing if you were writing an essay on this character. So, now I will say, this is a more obscure topic, which is what I said when I was asking this question about sources. So there actually are not a ton of secondary sources on Prince Saunders. There are a few more than this, but they are pretty obscure. Like I said, it was pretty hard for me to find them myself. So, I mean, it makes sense to me this is the list you're getting, but just keep this in mind. If you're looking for, some pretty obscure historical information, probably isn't the place to look for it. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask it an essay question. And I'm going to question it about some of the topics we've already talked about. And in fact, I think I'm going to refresh here. So we can have a clear screen. And also, I don't know really how it works, if it's sort of basing its responses on the conversations it has with you. But anyway, let's clear the slate, and then we're going to ask it 2 essay questions, one about Jefferson and education, and one about Saunders. Okay, so we've got write me an essay on Thomas Jefferson's writings and policy regarding public education. Right, so this is what a lot of teachers and professors are seeing. Students handing in essays that are obviously created by ChatGPT. So we'll see how good a job it does. I gotta be honest, my faith is not too high after looking at the sources it provided us, but we'll see. I will say the first issue with this is that you don't have any footnotes or sources cited. That's going to be a big issue if you're turning in a history paper. There are some sources referenced, right? They're talked about, but you would like to see the sources included. Just one reason why you shouldn't use this to write a paper for you. Really on any topic, but especially on history. Our first paragraph, is pretty general, but it's, good enough, I suppose. While he's best known for his political philosophy and authorship, Jefferson's contributions to the idea of public education reflect his deep commitment to Republican ideals and civic responsibility. He believed that education was essential for the health of the Republic and the protection of individual liberties. His writings and policies on public education laid the groundwork for many of the principles that continue to underpin American education today. I say that last point, that's a big claim to make, but I'd say you could substantiate that, maybe. But, this, though, is more subjective, as any essay will be. This intro is largely fine. So this section here on the bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, a lot of this is fairly accurate, but it's sort of undermined by a pretty basic mistake, where it says his 1786 work is from 1779. The bill itself was never actually passed by the legislature, but the date here is incorrect, right? So a basic mistake. It got the date right earlier, and we saw them reference the same bill earlier, and they got the date 1779 correct. Here it's incorrect. So in our next paragraph here, they talk about how, for Jefferson, ignorance was the greatest threat to liberty, which I'd say is true. To Jefferson, ignorance was one of the greatest threats to liberty. They reference a letter to George Wythe. Jefferson talks about his ideas of education, his bill as well. Once again, they've got the date wrong. So I recognized this quote when I read it, right? This is one of the letters I referenced when I wrote that paper back in my undergrad. It's from 1786, not 1787, right? So this is once again pretty problematic. And if you weren't familiar with the original source, you would have no reason not to believe this, right? The date is only 1 year wrong. I don't know why the date is wrong, but I think a lot of people would read this and take it at face value. But the date is wrong, right? I don't know why. Once again, it's not massively off, but it seemed to me it would be pretty easy to get the date right. But the date is incorrect once again. I will say, as we go through this, not only is there issues with the information, but also the writing is really not incredible. You know what I mean? This is not what I'd call an in-depth essay. For example, the next paragraph here, where they talk about the 1779 proposal, which is the bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. So they get the date right here, and they got it wrong earlier. It doesn't make any sense to me. But this is a restatement of what we saw in that previous paragraph. You're basically just saying the same thing over again, with a couple more details added in, but entirely unnecessary. If I was editing, I'd say combine these into one paragraph and don't get the date wrong. Also cite your sources. Next here we have a section on the University of Virginia. Now, it's obviously relevant to the topic at hand. I was more talking about public education as the general diffusion of knowledge among the people. I guess I could have been more specific in the question I was asking. This is obviously a much narrower group of people intending to be educated. I will say there's a great book on the foundation of the University of Virginia by Jefferson, by Alan Taylor, great American historian, called Thomas Jefferson's Education. A good read if you're interested. So, I guess if I was critiquing, I'd say, oh, let me specify my question more. But it's a little out of step with the rest of the information here. But I suppose it's obviously relevant to the question of Jefferson and education, just a bit different than the sort of primary public education we've been talking about. It's university education. Talks about how, though he had a broader idea of education than most, he was still exclusionary, which is true. How a lot of his ideas form the bedrock of modern public schooling in the US. Yeah, there's merit to that suggestion. And then just a wrap-up conclusion. So, I would say, this would not get a very good grade, Well, if your professor found out it was made by AI, which I think would be pretty obvious, you'd get a straight-up F, 0 out of 100. But even if I'm grading this on its own merits, it's got very basic factual issues. That's really bad. There's a lot of repetition in here. Beyond some pretty surface-level platitudes, there's not really many arguments or points being made. So I would definitely not rely on this to write you an essay that you needed to turn in. First of all, because you'll get in a lot of trouble, but also because you'll run into these pretty basic issues of writing and just basic historicity. So our second question here, our second essay question, is write me a biographical essay on Prince Saunders, or Sanders, the African-American education advocate. Okay, so here we have our essay. There's a mistake in the first sentence here. It says he's an educator, lawyer, and diplomat. He wasn't a lawyer, so Prince Saunders never worked as a lawyer. There's a rumor that later in his life he served as the Attorney General in Haiti. This is not substantiated. I don't believe this. You'll see it some places. But he definitely wasn't a lawyer. Educator, diplomat, I'd agree with those. I don't know if diplomat's the right word for it, but sure. But lawyer, he was not a lawyer. Through his leadership in both the US and Haiti, Saunders emerged as a critical figure in the early Black Atlantic world, using education as a tool for empowerment and social change. I'd say that's accurate. Though, reading a sentence like that, I'm once again reminded of my question from earlier, where exactly does it get this information from? And, more pointedly, where is it plagiarizing from? I imagine that PhD dissertation from Alcinat I mentioned earlier. So, I would be wondering where does this information comes from, and since it's not citing its sources, what sort of plagiarism are we seeing here? This next paragraph is relatively fine. I will say, I don't know if we know that he was actually born in Lebanon, Connecticut, but he was associated with that town early in his life, so maybe I wouldn't say born, but the rest of it's true. I'm being cautious here because there's been so much false information. Yeah, so it talks about Saunders' time in Boston, then his time in Haiti, where he helped establish a system of public education based on the British Lancastrian method, which emphasized cost-effective and scalable institution through student monitors. Yeah, this stuff is largely accurate. Talks about the Haitian papers, which we mentioned earlier. So we wrap up with his legacy, significance of his life, conclusion. I would say this one is less objectionable. I mean, there are some quibbles I have here and there, but I would argue that the big issue with this one is that it's lacking a lot of information. Now, I imagine that's because the AI had issue gaining access to a lot of the sources that would be necessary to write something like this. But really, the latter part of Saunders' life is almost entirely not covered in here. Talks a little bit about his time with Christoph, but only really 1815, 16, nothing after that, right? Now, there's a big gap sort of following 1820, 23, where we don't know a whole lot or really much of anything about Saunders' life. But there is a lot here, especially him going back and forth between Britain and Haiti in the US, and his advocacy in Haiti and among free Black communities on the East Coast in America that is not included here. Now, of course, this is only a certain length, but considering what they have included, there's a lot that they have not. So I'd say, once again, for this, there are some basic issues, like the mentioning of lawyer up here. This would also not get a good grade, though largely because you're missing a lot, right? You're missing a lot of information, a lot of stuff here. There's just a lot that is not covered, right? So this is also not a sort of cohesive and comprehensive biographical essay, which is what I asked for. You would think that even for a biographical essay from ChatGPT, they try and wrap up the story with the end of his life or the end of his work, but they didn't, really. They sort of skipped from the midpoint right to past the end. So I guess my concern's a little lower because there are less blatant historical falsehoods in here, but also not a great example of a historical essay. Alright, so I think I will wrap up my experiment there. It took us quite a while to get through all of those questions, but like I told you at the beginning, we were going to do a wide swath of different questions. Those daily questions I talked about, academic questions, and within those two groups, ranging from simple questions to far more complex. I think we saw here that if the AI has access to widely available information for pretty simple, objective questions, it can answer those relatively well, though the lack of sources makes me quite uncomfortable. But when given questions that are a little more obscure, a little more subjective, a little more complex, it really starts to fall apart. I was actually shocked that I think the worst thing we saw here was in asking for source lists. That was something I thought maybe it could actually do, right? Because like I said, oftentimes if you're talking to teachers or professors, they'll always tell you, well, don't use Wikipedia as a source, don't rely on that for information, but you can go and look through the sources that Wikipedia has, its bibliography, on any particular topic, and maybe you can find some useful stuff. So I'm thinking, well, maybe we can see that here. But actually, the source list was the worst part of this. It was making up entirely false sources, misidentifying sources. I mean, that's some really bad stuff. So, my read on this overall is that this is a very unreliable source for historical information, and thus, you should not rely on it if you are looking to research or to write an essay or whatever. You know, even just doing a simple Google search is better than relying on AI, especially if you can find a simple, reputable source. You know, it doesn't need to be some intense, obscure academic journal. There are a lot of government sources, museum sources out there that are pretty widely accessible, but still provide accurate information, which I think is what we're all looking for. So that's my take on using AI for any of this. I think you sort of saw how it played out throughout the video. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And with that, I hope all you guys are having a fantastic day today. Make sure to do good historical research. That's my piece of advice to all of you. So I will see you guys all again next time. Goodbye.